You actually have the full, not quite the full board, but you have a quorum. Amherst Media is with us in the house. I do think you're good to go.
All right, thank you, Pam.
You're welcome.
Welcome to the Amherst Planning Board meeting of September 17th, 2025. My name is Doug Marshall, and as chair of the Amherst Planning Board, I am calling this meeting to order at 6:34 p.m. This meeting is being recorded and is available live stream via Amherst Media. Minutes are being taken. Pursuant to Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, extended by Chapter 2 of the Acts of 2023, and further extended by Chapter 2 of the Acts of 2025, this planning board meeting will be conducted via remote means using the Zoom platform. The Zoom meeting link is available on the meeting agenda, posted on the town website's calendar listing for this meeting, or go to the planning board webpage and click on the most recent agenda, where the Zoom link is listed at the top of the page. No in-person attendance of the public is permitted. However, every effort will be made to ensure the public can access the meeting in real time via technological means. In the event public access is disrupted, or for reasons of economic hardship or despite best efforts, we will post an audio or video recording, transcript, or other comprehensive record of proceedings as soon as possible after the meeting on the town's website. Board members, I will take a roll call. When I call your name, unmute yourself, answer it affirmatively, and return to mute. Bruce Colden.
Here.
Fred Hartwell.
Present.
Jesse Major.
Present.
I, Doug Marshall, am present. Angus McLeod.
Present.
Johanna Newman.
Present.
And Jarrah Smith is not present at this point. He has indicated he will join us at a later time in the meeting. Board members, if technical issues arise and the discussion needs to pause, it will be noted in the minutes. Please use the raise hand function to ask a question or make a comment, and I will call on you to speak. After speaking, remember to remute yourself. To the general public, the general public comment item is reserved for public comment regarding items not on tonight's agenda. Please be aware the board will not respond to comments during general public comment period. Public comment may also be heard at other times during the meeting when deemed appropriate by the planning board chair. Please indicate you wish to make a comment by clicking the raise hand button when public comment is solicited. If you have joined the meeting using a telephone, please indicate you wish to make a comment by pressing *9 on your phone. When called on, please identify yourself by stating your full name and address, and put yourself back into mute when finished speaking. Residents can express their views for up to 3 minutes or at the discretion of the planning board chair. If a speaker does not comply with these guidelines or exceeds their allotted time, their participation may be disconnected from the meeting. Okay, that's the preamble. Time is 6:37. First item on the agenda is minutes. However, I did not see any minutes in the packet. Pam, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. At some point, probably soon, it would be helpful to me if you would let me know how many minutes behind are we. Maybe you could email me sometime in the next week or so.
Sure.
If we need to pause in terms of canceling a meeting or something to allow you to catch up, we certainly could consider that. Okay, next item on the agenda. It's 6:38 and we have public comment period. I am seeing 2 attendees from the public. This is the point in the meeting where I usually read the names of the public attendees that I can see so they all know who else is in the room. The 2 members of the public, if either of you want to make a comment at this time about something that doesn't appear later on the agenda, now's the time to do that. So raise your hand, please. So I see Aiden Sabina, or maybe Sabina Aiden, and Maria. There's no last name. All right, so at Thus far, neither of them have raised their hand to make a comment. I'll give them a couple more seconds and then we'll move on. We actually, our next item is advertised for 6:40, I believe. So we will wait at least a minute here until it turns into 6:40 to get to that item. I'm just looking at the clock, waiting for my clock to turn to 6:40. I do not see any hands raised from our two public attendees. All right, my clock just changed. I don't know about yours.
Mhm.
So at this point, I'm going to conclude there is no public comment offered this evening, and we'll move on. Next item is a public hearing, site plan review, and a special permit request, advertised for 6:40 p.m. SPR 2025-08 and SPP 2025-01. The applicant is Archipelago Investments, LLC. Project name is Gould Way and Lannon Lane. This hearing is continued from 5 previous meetings: May 7th, June 4th, June 18th, July 16th, and August 20th. Request site plan review approval under section 3.325 of the zoning bylaw to construct a new mixed-use development with 3 buildings, including 140 residential units, approximately 12,000 square feet of commercial space, 180 parking spaces and associated site improvements, and request a special permit under footnote A of Table 3, Article 6 of the zoning bylaw to modify the front setback beyond the maximum required, building height to exceed the maximum allowed, and the number of floors to exceed the maximum allowed. This is located in the BVC Village Center Business Zoning District. The parcels on map 25B, it's 2 parcels, 52 and 58. All right. I believe from an email that was in the packet, the applicant has requested to continue to October 22nd. And Nate, would it be correct that as in our past continuations, we don't want to take any testimony or have any discussion? We simply want to go to a motion to continue and leave it at that.
Correct. Yep. I
Okay.
will, yeah, I'll say that, on the 22nd, we could have maybe a more discussion. The applicant is still meeting with the Conservation Commission, so there really are no updates. I'm hoping by that date there'll be something.
Okay. Okay. Jesse?
I was going to move to continue to October 22nd.
All right.
Maybe at
Thank you.
6:40 p.m.
Should we, Nate or Pam, what do we have on the agenda? Would 6:40 work again?
Actually 6:35 is what we should do. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
6:35.
All right, thank you. And Bruce, did I see you raise your finger to second it? He has nodded yes for
Yes.
those who are just
Okay.
listening. Okay, so we have a motion to continue to 6:35 at, I'm sorry, to October 22nd at 6:35 p.m. So we'll go right into our vote for that. Bruce, why don't we start with you?
I approve.
All right. Fred,
Aye.
Angus,
Yes.
Jesse,
Aye.
Johanna,
Aye.
and I'm an aye as well. That's 6 in favor, 1 absent. The motion carries.
Okay.
So Bruce, I see your hand.
Yes, Doug, if I may, just a comment on the archipelago application, simply to say that if anybody is curious here, it might be worth looking at the October 27th Conservation Commission hearing, about 45 minutes in.
Did you
and
mean
we
to
can,
say October 27th?
Yeah.
I probably meant to say August 27th.
August, okay.
Yeah. I found that quite interesting and certainly helped me manage my expectations around this project.
All right. August 27th.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. Okay, the next item on the agenda is Planning Board reorganization and authorization. We still need to appoint a board liaison to the design review board. So Nate, I think at our last meeting, you were going to talk to Karen on,
Yeah, excuse me. I didn't reach out to Karen. I reached out to the town manager's office as they work with board and committee members. She's still on the design review board. And so it was a discussion that was, I think the town manager was out of the office a bit and kind of deciding, how to proceed. So my understanding is that Karen was voted the planning board representative, and the term expires next June. So they can, Karen can continue sitting on the design review board. The planning board chooses another representative, then we can, move that forward. But at the last meeting, it seemed like everyone was, had opportunities and no one volunteered. So.
okay. Board members, is there anyone since the last meeting that you suddenly have a burning desire to be on the DRB starting now as opposed to maybe next summer? All right, I am not seeing any hands raised or facial expressions indicating great excitement and urgency. All right, so we will leave it at that. Nate, I guess if you can let the town manager know that we will not appoint a new member at this point. The second item under that general category was related to authorization to sign approval not required and subdivision plans. You want to kind of give an overview of that, Nate?
Yeah, typically every year, along with the voting of officers, there's a document, a letter that's provided that names the signatory authority for the planning board that gets filed with the town clerk, and it might actually go to the registry too. But becomes a legal document to say here's who can sign on behalf of the board for these two types of plans.
It does go to the registry, Nate, and the land records office.
All right.
And so generally it's the officers. You make a motion to approve the officers to sign those A&Rs or subdivision plans.
All right, so it's just me as chair. I'm forgetting who my vice chair is. Is it still Johanna?
Johanna.
And then secretary is who? Bruce?
Bruce.
All right, and we don't have a treasurer, do we?
No.
So thank you for laughing, Bruce. So the motion would be that the board endorses having the chair, the vice chair, and the secretary authorized to sign the A&Rs and the subdivision plans on behalf of the board. Is that accurate?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Bruce?
So moved.
All right. Jesse?
I second that.
All right. Thank you both. Any discussion among the board? Not seeing any hands raised. Go ahead and go to a vote. We'll start at the end of the alphabet of your last names. That means I'm going to start with Johanna.
Aye.
Thank you. And Jesse
Aye.
and Angus
Aye.
and Fred
Aye.
and Bruce.
Aye.
And I'm an aye as well. That motion carries 6 in favor, 1 absence. Thank you all. All right, so that's it for number 4 of our agenda. We can now move on to the meatiest probably part of the meeting, which is
Doug,
the general housing discussion. Yes.
before we do, I thought also that there was um, a move to allow you alone to sign decisions. Is that something that also needs a vote, or is that just a declaration?
Nate, we voted something like that last time, didn't we?
Did we? Oh, maybe I was not
Yeah,
here.
that
or
was,
forgot.
yeah, thanks. That was voted. It's a, currently it's an internal document. I think that in the future, if we wanted to, we could change the rules and regulations, hold a public hearing. I think there is probably other things to update in the rules and regs, but for now, that's sufficient.
Oh, my apologies.
That's all right. Never hurts to check.
Mhm.
All right, so next is general housing discussion. Continuing the discussion about potential changes in zoning for housing around town. Clearly, the last thing we've talked about was an overlay for the apartment area in North Amherst. Who would want to open this? Nate, I think you sent around a new document for us. You are muted.
Yeah, I was just trying to get my screen set up. Yeah, thanks, everyone. So I think some of this also, there's a few reasons why I think it's nice to step back. At the previous housing and zoning subcommittee, there was some discussion about, why focus on North Amherst and kind of what's the context and the idea of that. And I think, Jesse and others said, well, there's other parts of town. It's just, it's easier to focus on one rather than a few at the same time. I also think it's kind of apropos of the housing production plan being finished. And I think it's not, the planning board's recommended it. The town councils referred it to CRC, the housing production plan. But staff are still thinking about having the planning board and trust maybe meet next month or early November to talk about housing strategies, and this would also then apply townwide. It goes to the idea of having a zoning subcommittee as part of the housing committee too, to look at zoning. And so kind of looks, we have a zoning priorities list, and how does that work townwide? And so, I think tonight could just be like, well, what are some other areas of interest? And it could be that it's where would it meet the same kind of purpose and intent as the North Amherst overlay? And then also, what are other areas in town to explore for, new development or changes to zoning? And so there was a few maps in the packet. One was kind of just a base map showing streets and properties. One was a figure ground, and one was I'll call it a simplified zoning map. It tried to symbolize, commercial and business zones and then residential zones. And we can look at that as well. There's also some other zoning districts. So yeah, I think, the planning board, I guess it was 2 years ago already, we had extra meetings to talk about, what are some ideas around town, what are some areas to look at. And, this to me, this is also it's picking up on that conversation. I think the University Drive overlay was, some fruition of that discussion. We had talked about East Amherst, we were looking at North Amherst. In the past, there had been discussions about Gateway. I'll just, we can call that from, downtown to University along North Pleasant. There's Olympia Drive, where there's a few developments happening. And there's other parts of town. I mean, there's other village centers, there's other areas. And so, I can share my screen. We could just talk about it generally. I think, the North Amherst overlay is interesting. It's an idea where it's probably predominantly students. I don't think we're necessarily going to zone for that. We could, but if you look at the townwide map, that area is proximal to the university, and there's the ability to probably have multimodal transportation to the campus and other places. And although there may be cars parked in that area, hopefully they're not driving, individually every day. and then maybe there's other parts of town that we could explore for other kinds of zoning. We do have 3 institutions in town, Hampshire College, Amherst, and UMass. There's a lot of land there. I recently gave a presentation to council this week on the master plan. And, one of the questions that was asked, it was asked a few times, was how much land in Amherst is developable, and what, can we map it? And the housing production plan did that a little bit. I mean, generically speaking, we'd say that half of Amherst isn't developable, and that's true to an extent. I think that there's conservation land, there's agricultural preservation land, there's some institutional land, there's wetlands and riverfront, but some institutional land could be developed. So Amherst College could develop some of its properties, Hampshire and UMass could, zoning could change. I think that, but there is a fair amount of town that, whether or not we zone it, it has probably limited development potential, just because of certain constraints. And so it's really about, okay, what can we do in the other 50% of Amherst that may have the infrastructure? There isn't water and sewer everywhere, water in most places. There's, a few places without sewer that have septic. So those are in the outlying areas, South Amherst and kind of Northeast Amherst. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just good to kind of have the conversation, and maybe, and from that, there can be other explorations. So, the housing production plan has a number of strategies. I'll mention cottage style development, right? So multiple principal dwellings on a property, or how, I think we have to work on that, but, it could be that we like this idea of having 6 to 10 units on a property or some area, and maybe that's appropriate in some zoning districts, and maybe then we're also looking at some other strategy for somewhere else in town. So from this conversation and with the zoning list, we could come up with a few ideas, and we could continue to talk about over the next month or two. I think the overlay in North Amherst, I think it's at a point where we probably should have a public meeting about it. We can discuss it more tonight, but I think there's a lot of questions and concerns by residents in that area. I'm not sure, how much support there is. Generally speaking, I think some of this conversation tonight is to kind of frame that as well, to say, well, we spent a long time talking about ADUs, and the concern is that, oh my goodness, they're all going to be student rentals. It's like, well, could we talk about maybe where we could house students? It's really hard to zone for the end user. So I was just in a meeting today, and someone said, well, is there a way we can change some of the development methods to prevent students? And I'm like, not really. You can do age restricted housing is allowed. And that's about it. Affordable housing typically doesn't include students. It does. I mean, there's some variables there, but most often undergraduate students don't qualify for affordable housing. So there's very few legal mechanisms to, zone or have development that's not for students. And so, the reality is our housing market has that. And there's other pieces to the development too. Is it mixed use? Is it economic development? Is it general growth? So
Nate, I think one way to zone for students is to do it geographically, because we know where their desire line is. So if we, upzone for students in the vicinity of the university, it's pretty likely students will end up in those buildings if anything new is built. And I mean, that is probably a rational way to zone for students. But in terms of sort of the typology of the buildings, yeah, I agree. It's not practical to try to do that. I mean, unless I suppose you could limit the number of kitchens or something to sort of turn them into quasi dormitories that, I mean, I suppose there's something you could do with that, but I haven't thought about it much.
right, yeah. So we have the definition of a residential use classification, social dormitory, which is different than an apartment, right? So the idea is a social dormitory is for matriculated students, and it can include like suite style living, whereas an apartment
Right.
is each unit is an individual dwelling unit.
Right. I guess the other thing I'll say is, there's, I don't know if it's a majority, but certainly there's a lot of people in town who don't want to see Amherst change its character. And so by doing by expanding the potential of the area right around the university, I guess we could, in fact, limit the amount of the rest of the town that changes, at least in terms of the built environment, whether, who lives in those old houses could change. So that's one approach, is to try to expand the housing right around the university and leave everything else alone. And the other approach would be to take a more distributed, to do it in a more distributed way, so that we increase the massing of, whether it's the village centers or it's just along the major roadways or some other criteria, or everywhere. We could just say we're going to eliminate single house zoning throughout Amherst, and now you can have up to 4 units or 6 to 10 units or whatever we want to say, and just see how that shakes out. Of course, that probably wouldn't get through council. But I think we could talk about the different approaches before we get too far into the areas, but that's my thoughts. Jesse, you've been patient. You're next.
Thanks. Thanks, Doug. I just wanted to, and thanks for the segue too. I just wanted to reiterate that's something Nate said when he started introducing the topic, but in a slightly different way, which is just to say for the record that after University Drive, the increasing density at already apartment zone properties was the next sort of biggest impact, at least the subcommittee imagined we could make, given the proximity to the university and that it's already somewhat dense, and the physical topography of the North Amherst that we're talking about really lends itself to density that, exactly what you said, Doug, would not change the physical look of the majority of, well, certainly that neighborhood, and even to the eyes of people driving by. And so that's at least why in large part, why the subcommittee focused on North Amherst first. And that was sort of the order, if my memory is correct. You're right, 2 years ago when I first joined the board, we had those meetings, we looked at the different areas, and we all agreed that University Drive seemed like the sort of simplest way to start, and that North Amherst was an attractive second. If I recall, I think we had talked about East Amherst. We debated what would be next, East Amherst or North Amherst. And again, the point really I'm trying to make is North Amherst has been no way the only place we're looking at to decrease pressure on the neighborhoods in all of Amherst with student rentals. That's it for now. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I was just going to jump in, Doug. I think geographically is a great approach for students. I think, there's the existing village centers, and then there's major roadways. For instance, East Amherst, what we had talked about at one point was, say from the railroad from Hamshaw Lumber, down to however far you want to go on College Street and beyond. Could it go to the Fort River and Gatehouse Road area? Does it stop at the intersection by Florence Savings Bank and Cumberland Farms? In any event, there could be increased density there. And then the discussion was, well, right, depending on how it's designed, is it mostly students? Is that where we want to have people then commuting through town? At the same time, I feel like there is some ability to say, well, we do a few things at the same time. Maybe East Amherst is, you can have a density bonus or increase floor if you have, say, more affordability. Or I think, a 40R district is, the town has applied for a technical assistance grant to look at a 40R district, which is a smart growth zoning overlay with some percentage of affordable housing, 20 or 25%, and some minimum densities and design standards. And I think East Amherst is one area we mentioned, and there's a few others in town. And so, there could be some other creative ideas to say, well, maybe we do a few things. We look at a few overlays or a few areas around campus, and then we also look at this smart growth zoning for East Amherst to achieve some other density with some affordability component. And I think they all could happen. It's a matter of kind of, I guess, capacity and time and what we think is reasonable. I get it, North Amherst, right? So to Jesse's point, North Amherst residents will say it's already the densest part of town, given the amount of multi-unit developments there. And so the concern is, well, how does all that play out in terms of emergency response and traffic impacts and visual impacts? And so I think, what the overlay, what we've done so far to me is that I think that there's a really nice framework there, and some of it is, I think having some public meetings about it, making some tweaks. But I think there's always going to be that concern, right? So if we said, the area of north of Fearing, let's densify it on Olympia Drive, some areas might be a little bit more isolated from existing neighborhoods, but I think geographically, in the early 2000 teens, the University Town Gown Relation, UTAC steering committee, they also identified a few areas proximal to the university and said these make a lot of sense. And one was actually redeveloping the university apartments with more density. And one of their concepts was essentially putting in a second street and having a grid network and look like basically townhouse developments. And they said without much density or without much height, you could, double density, just having a different site layout. It wasn't nearly as open as it is now. Mass Ave's an area where, it's still university land, but is there public-private partnerships possibilities? And so, even if there's, to me, it's like, if we say Mass Ave's a great location, whether or not, I think to me, it would be nice to have a map that said, here are some areas identified, whether or not we work on them, or if it's an imminent possibility, it's nice to say for the conversation with North Amherst, here are all these other areas that are possibilities that will be examined and assessed at some point in more depth.
All right, Bruce.
The the most consequential objection that I've heard so far as the North Amherst proposition is concerned, the proposition to an overlay that would increase potentially probably threefold. That seems to be our so-called magic number. The most consequential objection, we've heard the traffic objection, we've heard the party noise objection, and there are ways in which we've responded to that by saying we could do this, we could do that, management plans, reduced or eliminate parking. Also, there are workarounds, potentially workarounds. But Kathy Shane, when she was on, she said, the existing housing at, say, Puffton Village, there's a lot of it there. And we would be talking about substituting 3 times as many new units for the units that are currently there. She said those units that are currently there are rather affordably rented. And the new units, she asserted, would likely be far more expensive to rent, all of them, except, of course, the affordable housing fraction, which is 12%. And I can't think of a I think she's right, and I can't think of a workaround for that. But it seems to be something that we have to respond to, think about, or accept. We should at least, I think, quantify it by understanding what the current rents are, and we can reasonably project what the new rents are. So at least we could bracket that concern by putting numbers on it or data around it. But whereas we've come up with, I'll use the term workarounds just because it's easier for the purposes of conversation, for other large concerns that we in the population, we have. But is there a workaround for this concern? And I mean, I don't think we can obligate, we might not even be able to incentivize new developers to redevelopers to provide a greater fraction or put some kind of rent cap on it. But so I don't know what I don't know what a workaround for this concern is, and I think it's a real one. So I guess I would ask, who among us shares this concern? Have I characterized it accurately, or insufficiently, or mischaracterized it in some way that would help me wrestle this one along? Do we agree that this is perhaps the most consequential objection we're likely to encounter?
Jesse?
Thanks. Yes.
I
Bruce,
assume you're responding to Bruce. I think
Yes.
let's do that before you do your next comment.
No, that's why I raised my hand. This came up at our meeting last week at the subcommittee as well. I totally agree. That's a important concern. I'm not sure I agree with the statement, though. Anecdotal evidence from my own family and their friends who live in Puffton Village, for example, tell me it's not at all cheaper than other places around town. So I don't have a good amount of data, but that's what I think we do need. I'm not sure how easy that will be to gather. I'm not sure if the actual data, what's happening, is on the leases. And a couple examples I do know of where people are not on leases and living in a shared bedroom and paying pretty high amounts of money. So I don't know how we're going to gather the accurate information, but I totally agree we should try. Not just for this area, but around town. And I was also just trying to find a while ago, someone, I think maybe it was Janet, had compiled a list of rents in local places that was circulated, I think, among planning board. I'll dig that up also to see what it is.
All right. I assume, Nate, as part of the rental registration program, do the landlords indicate the rent that's charged or not?
Not necessarily. I mean, I was after the housing subcommittee meeting, I was looking at like the off-campus housing office at UMass and other, like apartmentrentals.com or whatever, and looking at the rates, and it's hard because there's sometimes there's a range, and so in some places it looked like maybe the units were cheaper, and others it didn't. To say the per bedroom cost if you wanted to break it down that way. But yeah, I think we could source some data and present it.
Do
I don't think
the
there's a way.
landlords have websites that say, here's the rooms I have and
Yeah, the
the
property
units and
managers
how I
often
rent
do.
them?
Yeah, yeah.
I would think that information would be somewhat advertised.
I feel like it's a prisoner's dilemma, though, right? That kind of game, the economic game, where it's like you don't know what the other one's charging, so everyone keeps charging more, and it's so if we think that someone can get so much, and we know that it's whether or not the new apartments, but between Fieldstone and 11 to 13 East Pleasant and whatever else is in the area, that becomes the benchmark. And so
Yeah.
agreed that if these were new units and they're they will be nicer maybe or bigger, whatever, they will be more expensive. I think it's a really difficult thing to manage that. I would say the idea would be to let's get enough housing supply where maybe there's a vacancy rate that the prices stabilize. It's hard to manage through zoning. There's probably a few mechanisms we can incentivize more affordability or more units or deeper affordability, but it wouldn't cover all of the units, right? It would just be a focused amount.
All right, Angus and then Johanna.
Yeah, I just have a quick comment, which was in the planning subcommittee, I looked up what Puffton was charging. It was about $1,000 per bedroom. So they have different sized units, and so that there's some flexibility there, but that's not a particularly cheap unit to start with. And I guess I would just echo what Nate is asserting, that tripling the supply of available apartments in that area would, yes, if they're newer, there could be some upward price pressure on rents, but if we continue to try to push greater supply, it's going to alleviate the housing issues with students and drive down rents across town entirely. I mean, that's just basic supply and demand.
All right, Johanna.
That's what I was going to say. Supply and demand curves. So I'd be happy to see data, but I have enough information tonight, and I don't think it's worth spending staff time like looking up rents throughout town. So Bruce, I guess in your question, I don't know that this would satisfy Councillor Shane, but I would just go back to basic market principles of supply and demand. And that when we increase supply, costs go down.
I'll make it my business to find the answers to rentals in Puffton Village. And so I'll make a little 2-paragraph report on that. But it sounds like what the 3 things that have been said, that maybe my concern is not as doesn't rise to the height that level that I may have believed it would. Thank you for that.
I was going to comment, Bruce, that I think any new construction is going to set the benchmark for the town, because if there's plenty of demand and somebody has to pay that amount, the other landlords are gonna adjust their rent to however competitive in comparison to that new construction they have to be in order to attract the tenants that they want. So if somebody's charging a low amount now, it's meaning that they don't want to compete with the high-end quality market or something, they can still do that, but they would be able to raise their rent just because the prevalence of higher rent in town would be greater because there'd be new construction. All right, so Nate, I'm going to let you jump ahead of Jesse just because you may have something about this topic before we leave it.
Yeah, I was gonna mention, Bruce, I can help with those rent pieces and also the housing production plan. So the 2013 plan and then the recent plan might also have, I know the 13 one did, I think this one may have had a chart with a, with properties and their rent. So, I can look for that and provide it to you. I don't think we have to dig too hard. But I think there's already some information already available. And we could, if it's the same apartments or the same properties from 13 to recently, we could just, have, some comparisons over the last 10, 15 years and provide that information.
All right. Bruce, I'd also say I'd rather see more capacity in town, even if that means the average rent goes up a little bit for student housing at least. Okay, Jesse, you had your hand up. Did you have a new topic or anything?
No, just maybe a last comment on this topic, which was just, I think the goal of gathering data is to be prepared for that objection raised, that we're taking away the lower income housing, not so much to convince us. So I think we need to have data from these places, but also from other places around town. The newest places are very transparent. I think that all the websites advertise the amounts, but I do think all of these that we're talking about are probably more than a lot of the single family housing that's available. Probably because there's more than 4 renters in most houses, but I don't know how to tackle that one in terms of presenting data.
Yeah, my only data is that the house across the street from me only has 4 cars in front of it this year as opposed to 5. So maybe we're hitting capacity here. All right. Nate, did we get enough out of this conversation this evening? Should we move on, or do we want to talk some more?
I'll share my screen just quickly, if this is visible for folks. Let me.
It is unless you want us to look at parcels.
No, I mean, I think just generally this is a figure ground. This is North Amherst for now. So here's where my cursor is the overlay area we're talking about. Cushman's over here. And so, there is, there's always been ideas of like, could you connect this neighborhood through or, do certain things? We haven't added many new roads, right? So it's what kind of infrastructure do we have? I think if I go over here to the zoning map, here's the same area. And so, the dark purple and purple is what our business zones, and the I guess this is like yellow and browns are residential zones. So, in North Amherst, here's the overlay in this area. There is a village center nearby. There's not a lot of area zoned in Amherst for, what would we consider like a business area. This is a, so I think it's just worth noting. So, if we increase density here, to me, there's a benefit to the village center here. As we're moving further down to the town center, here's the downtown. So, our BG and BL district isn't that, it's almost like one property wide off North Pleasant Street and Triangle Streets. Here's the railroad tracks, and here's East Amherst. Here's, commercial district along Route 9. So most of downtown is surrounded by residential zoning. If we're keeping moving south, here's Pomeroy Village intersection. So village center residence zoning, some commercial zoning. South Amherst is mostly residential, the South Amherst area. And then Atkins has, the few areas zoned for Business Village Center. And so, if we're talking about density and what's allowed now, there's few areas in town that could accommodate, say, what we provided, what can be done in these areas that are darker purple, right? So if we want to have 4-story buildings in multi-unit development, if you're looking at the zoning map, most of the areas in town wouldn't support it right now. And so that's to say, if we talk about this, we would say, oh, we like East Amherst, we like, this area north of, we'll say the old Gateway, or we like some areas up in North Amherst or East Amherst. I think that's great to have. And then some of it would be, okay, well, what does the zoning allow now, and how do we move about changing that? And so, the reason why we do overlays is if we said, well, let's just change the area here in North Amherst to allow so many units per acre, and it's this zoning district, you can see that this zoning district covers a lot of areas of town. And so we've just made that change zoning, for the whole district. And so usually that's why we'd approach it from the overlay perspective. I think, it may be that some of these other zones could be changed. So, if we think RVC is in the right location, but it doesn't allow the right density, do we tweak just the RVC zones, as we get down closer into kind of the details of how this, the mechanics of how this would work. So I think that's, I think for now, I think we have a good start. I wouldn't mind hearing a few areas that we would want to consider, and staff could, refine that with another map. So, if we had we've mentioned a few tonight, and if we have a few more, I think that's a good start.
Well, Nate, because most of these business areas that are allowed, where density is allowed, are surrounded by residential, we get a lot of pushback on any contemplation of expanding those areas into the residential neighborhood. But I think there are probably a number of places where, from a sort of urban structure point of view, you could expand those areas slightly and get, incremental expansion. And whether that would be an overlay or whether it would just be a change of zoning of a few parcels from a residential use to a business use. I guess we could get your advice on how to do that. One other thing I'll say, we've mostly talked, when we've talked about density, about allowing higher and larger buildings. Another way to do it would be to basically reduce the minimum lot size and allow, say, row houses. The minimum lot size could be 16 feet wide and 100 feet deep. And, my half acre could be split into 4 or 5 row houses if you did something like that. And that kind of zoning could be more supportive of individual family ownership. Whereas the large buildings, they're going to be rental units pretty much forever. So, I think we do have some influence on the ownership structure and possibly the occupancy, depending on how we geographically configured it. All right, now Jesse and then Angus.
Great, thanks, Doug. I completely agree with everything you just said. And that leads
Except
nicely.
where would you do that?
Well, that leads nicely into what I was going to say. So with full transparency that it literally is my backyard, I think I'd love to have a deeper look at not just what was previously called Gateway, but basically north of Fearing. So the area immediately abutting the campus. And the reason to me, that's another prime location, just like the university, the North Amherst area we're looking at, because we can increase density and limit the number of cars, because students can easily walk and bike to campus in town. And I think that, to me, is a pretty high priority when we're thinking about areas. That's a constant conversation with all of our development proposals that we talk about in planning board, is what's the right number of cars? How do we reduce more traffic? All this over and over and over again. And so I think that's perfect. And I think that little strip between campus and Fearing is basically perfect for what you just said, Doug. This idea of townhouse building or some other style of allowable building that increases density without massively increasing height or footprint.
Okay, Angus.
Yeah, I would that I think that makes a lot of sense, Jesse. I think that's a wise idea. And I guess I also wonder. I don't want to derail our conversation. Are we thinking of talking about zoning priorities in this discussion as well, or is that a separate a thing for later in the meeting? I don't want to preempt things.
That was going to come later under the housing subcommittee report, but I guess you could
Great.
pull a few things if.
Well, I'm just thinking, several of the things that we're thinking about here are also zoning related. And so like one of the things that I was just looking at is, would it be possible, rather than thinking about if overlays seem like they're going to be kind of difficult, I think there's other ways that might be worth considering. I mean, for instance, that commercial strip over on College Street, we don't currently allow townhouses or apartments in the commercial zone. There's only a few commercial zones in town, and so that's one thing that we could consider, short of an actual overlay, to try and drive some changes in some of these pockets where it might be appropriate. But that was just one of the things that I was thinking about, in addition to thinking about redefining apartments to be slightly larger, or creating a kind of tiered classification of apartments so that in some specific areas we could possibly consider larger apartment buildings without going through the whole process of an overlay. That's all.
All right, great. Bruce.
I like the suggestion that Jesse made, coupled with your suggestion, Doug. When you made your suggestion, which was row houses, I thought, yes, that's a very it's a great way of making good, salubrious, dense housing that can be purchased, owned, and people can identify with. I know because a greater part of Melbourne, where I was born and grew up and lived, ultimately in the center is row houses. Exactly that, 16, 18, 20 feet wide, and 120 plus or minus feet deep. And however, it's a very different streetscape image from the street, and I think it would be jarring to do it unless it was done more uniformly in a district. And it would seem that the district that you're suggesting, Jesse, would be a very good place to encourage exactly that. Either that, or maybe encourage the kind of cottage style cluster things that I'm blanking on the guy. Ross Chapin famously did some very nice work, an architect in Washington State, Seattle area. But if we were to take that area that you're suggesting, Jesse, and treat it as an overlay, but not the way we're thinking about North Amherst or even University Drive, but with a different style of housing that would fit. It would change the neighborhood, but it would change it agreeably, I think, and very interestingly and effectively from in terms of our broad goals. So I like that idea. I like the coupling of what you said, Doug, and what you said, Jesse. I think that's a good idea, and it's also something that Jesse, I know you've been proposing or suggesting, that when we go and talk to this with other parts of it, with North Amherst, with people around town, that it's nice to have say, well, this is what we're thinking of for North Amherst, this is what we're thinking of for Fearing, and I will finish with an even more, and shall we say far more outrageous proposition, because you've got the map up in front of us here, and it was because I drive up and down East Pleasant Street all the time, and you can see, just keep it there. No, don't move it. Right opposite the, I think well, on the east side of East Pleasant Street, right down the bottom of that little leg of conservation, whether it's watershed protection or whatever it's the diagonally hatched land on the east side of East Pleasant Street. The point is that on that side, the land slopes fairly steeply down to that blue lagoon that's there. I guess it's the flood protection FP zone. But the top part of it is thoroughly buildable upland, and my sense was, well, this has been blanketly put into conservation, but the top sliver of that conservation along East Pleasant Street, opposite the university, would be a very good place to put student housing, because it would be exactly where we want it, and it would be away from almost all housing.
Bruce,
Parking, of course, would have to be taken, but that somehow wrestling some of that land out of conservation from a logical land use point of view, at least my logical land use point of view, would be another very good place. I just don't know whether you could achieve it.
Hey, Nate, could you bring up the figure ground again so Bruce can describe this location again?
Well,
is it north of Eastman Lane, north of the fire station?
No, it's south of that, well south of that. It's those parcels there, which are all owned by the Kestrel Trust.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So it's this. It's okay.
Yeah, but not that big circle, just a sliver,
Just
100 or 200 feet in from East Pleasant Street. You could do a very nice Stephen Hull type, I don't know, not Stephen Hull, Alva Alto type MIT building along Memorial Drive, just like that. Along that, it would be a wall on that street. It would be a beautiful opportunity. It would look wonderful. It would serve the purpose. It's in terms of what we're trying to achieve, it's a perfect opportunity. It's just that it happens to be in a place which we probably can't touch. Well, what a shame.
Well, okay, so you're talking about right across from the water tower.
Yes,
basically,
right across and a little bit up.
A little bit north.
Yes.
Okay,
and it's,
well,
at the
I
moment,
will say I have kind of coveted that row of houses there along there too, because, it's sort of a single set of frontage. I'm sure whoever lives there would hate me for saying it, but it would be a relatively low impact rezoning that could allow a fairly large amount of housing that was attractive and could house a lot of students right along that frontage.
yes. Well, I wasn't so much.
Those houses are kind of a single depth, because the next houses to the east are accessed off of Chestnut Street, or rather off of Strong Street, and they're their own cul-de-sac.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one way of thinking about that is if the zoning was to increase the value of those houses enough, that would perhaps be welcomed, or at least not objected to.
We wouldn't force them to move. We'd just give them an incentive to be bought out.
And so that would that's, I think, a little north of. Well, maybe you should have Nate point out your houses. Is it the houses south of those ones there?
That's the section from Strong Street up to the last house that I was thinking about.
Oh, okay.
And then north of that is the land that's not developed.
Yeah.
And then after that, that one next house north is a fairly historic. I don't remember whose house it is, but it's like from 1720 or something.
Well, that could be moved.
Well, maybe, so from there all the way up to, what is it, Olympia Drive, or what's the next road?
Yeah. I'm just saying that's a really attractive location for what we're trying to achieve. And so
All right.
maybe we list it as a
Yeah,
place of
we'd
interest.
really piss off about 10 people, 10 households.
Well, we might not really piss them off.
Yeah.
We might just wait for them to die, and their heirs are happy as Larry.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I was gonna just jump in quickly. The idea, Doug, of smaller lots is something in the zoning priorities. There's a 40Y, which is a starter home overlay, and it's something staff talked about and has talked about. But in the housing production plan and a number of documents, we said the zoning north of Triangle Street. Here's Kendrick Park. So here, and then even on the west side of Kendrick Park, is always said, well, especially in the housing production plan, it shows, I think both plans and other documents show this as like townhouse style development. And right now it's really just one or two big lots. And so, to me, it's like, well, if not an overlay, right, is there some way to say, you could have really small lots here to encourage, essentially it can be multi-unit development, but everything's on its own parcel. So it can be a fee
Right.
simple arrangement, even here as well. And so 40Y allows much smaller lots. The idea is to have starter homes. And so Mansfield is trying to do it, Mansfield, Mass. And they're essentially creating what is a cluster subdivision with really small lots. Some are single family homes, some are duplexes with a party wall, but they're trying to encourage, much smaller lots and have a fee simple ownership. I agree. It's, there's a way to try to incentivize it. We could try to have some zoning in place in certain areas to allow this. My thought is if what Jesse was saying north of Fearing in this area would be, we could do an overlay or have something that says, well, you have to have a townhouse style development, and have some design guidelines. So it isn't just a massive 5-story building. It could be, for instance, if, yeah, so there's probably a few different ways to do it, whether it's, one property or smaller properties. But I like the idea of smaller properties. And so that also speaks to cottage style development. If we like having a few single, principal dwellings on a property, could it be designed so that each one is on its own piece of land, or, otherwise it becomes like a condoized development, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, but it could be interesting to allow, 4 homes on a lot and each have them be on their own lot. It's just a different development approach. So
Yeah.
I
Well,
like that idea.
I mean, you kind of know from earlier conversations with me, but the two properties you highlighted kind of near Kendrick, I think that whole area could be larger scale than starter homes. That to me is a waste of high premium real estate. It's right downtown. But that's a conversation perhaps for another day.
Yeah, and I didn't mean, starter homes per se. I just like the idea is that the state is having this 40Y allowing much smaller lots for starter homes. But I think you could take that idea.
What's the advantage of using the 40Y as opposed to just zoning for smaller lots? Why do you need the 40 thing?
Yeah, I think, so there's a small financial incentive, and some of it would be, well, you could say you're using the state tool so the town can get some, points on a grant application. I agree. There's not, I actually think that it's probably easier to do it locally without going through the 40Y process in some instances. And so, for the west side of Kendrick Park and Triangle Street, to me, we would say, well, I like the idea of, townhouse or row style, 3 stories, maybe 4 under a roof. And that's not starter home, but I like the idea of having smaller lots, to encourage a different kind of development approach than, say, just a big apartment building. So,
well, and that kind of development often has an alley at the back that was where you put the trash and you park. And we have a really lousy street grid. In other words, we don't really have a grid at all. So have you guys ever thought about, where would you create new public roads if you had your druthers? More street, more frontage?
Yeah, I don't know if it's been done, not as a plan, say a more multi-department approach,
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, at one point, if we're scrolling down the map, it was contemplated that there'd be another street here, right? Between North Prospect and Lincoln.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think originally that was the idea when this was laid out. And
I've always thought Prospect, if it would be pretty easy to blow through to the next road north and pick up that street right across opposite that, you
right,
know, could Prospect continue all the way up to Fearing?
right. Yeah, I mean, I think what you said, Doug, about alleys, it's why the Triangle Street properties here are, why consultants look at it, because they're big enough that you still can have frontage development and you still then can have parking or another access around it just the way it is now. And so it, and it's a nice area for a transition. I think if we were talking about the commercial area down on College Street, there are some wetland constraints, but same thing, there's the ability in some areas to have, if not roads, but alleys behind buildings so that, you can put buildings up front and have parking and other things behind.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you described the College Street zone, you started at Hampshaw and
Right.
talked about going all the way down to Southeast Street. I
Yeah.
thought we actually talked about going all the way out to Rolling Ridge or,
Yeah, I think we talked about going to about here.
yeah.
Yep.
So, but that whole area, seems like it's more because of because it's not proximate to the university. If we put 10,000 students over there, we'd have huge traffic jams going through town to get to the university. So that kind of the development along College Street and Belchertown Road seem like they, those might be more geared towards families or, small individual owners and, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I know, just looking at the figure ground, it's like, okay, well, if you did allow smaller lots here and some design, it's like, could you have, much more density without having, you could just even allow 2-story buildings, but it would just, you could have much more density along the stretch of road.
How many stories is that new building just south of the Florence Bank on
Yeah, that's
South?
right here. That's
Yeah.
I think it's only 3 stories with a roof.
Is that
It's
right?
3 with a roof.
Okay.
That's my recollection.
Yeah.
All right. So it seems to me you could do 3 stories through a lot of that area without too much resistance.
Yeah, I think, so if we toggle back and forth, I think what they benefited from was this little piece of zoning that that allow 3 stories. Across the street does as well, but then everywhere else in East Amherst, right, you're limited to, commercial doesn't really allow much development at all because of the additional lot area per unit. And then the rest of the zoning in East Amherst doesn't allow any really multi-unit development. So you're right, there's a really limited ability right now in that area.
Yeah, wasn't it Kyle Wilson who said only 2% of Amherst could be developed for multifamily housing or something?
Yeah, it's actually a little less than 2%.
So if 50% is not developable at all, that would mean 4% of the developable land, or a little less, is actually available for multifamily.
Right. Yeah, I think the housing production plan is a nice jumping off point too, where, I think the town, we allowed all these multi-unit developments in the 60s and 70s and then changed our zoning. And so for the last so many years, we haven't allowed in all this area that's residentially zoned, we have townhouses and apartments by special permit and other, lot area or other requirements that really limits their development. And some of it is because, these zones are so big. And so, right, for instance, if we're thinking about East Amherst, that's where, to me, an overlay or some other approach here, like I said, if you change the zoning for this, this zone is, all over town. But right, maybe these areas really do need some other, whether it's a zoning approach or some other idea.
Yeah.
Because,
Well,
I
Cambridge,
agree, I think.
I mean, there certainly are places like Cambridge, Mass, which have a lot of a great many zoning districts.
Right.
They have some overlays too, but we could split some of these larger areas into many small areas and treat them on a more case-by-case basis.
Right, or, like, so we have resident village center and business village center, and it's like, well, do we make a tweak to resident village center and then rezone, because there's not much rezone for resident village center, and do we just then extend the RVC in certain areas and say, well, now we can allow townhouses and smaller apartment buildings, as opposed to just opening up to,
Yeah.
5 stories, we allow 3-story development in the RVC, and we just, we can move those zone lines, right? I think there's probably a few, I think that's an interesting approach.
All right. Any more? Johanna?
This has been a really interesting discussion, and I'm trying to figure out a little bit of like what's the form we give it to go from here. And then I went into this and have been listening, but I keep coming back to the idea that we should be guided by our town's master plan. Like that was, and yes, it's a little bit dated, but I think by and large it is still like what should be guiding our development. And that leads me to really focus on the downtown and the village centers. And as somebody who has spent the past 2 years working in a building on the north end of town, the whole shape of it feels incomplete. It's like, and so I don't quite know what's going on there, but like we have this beautiful park, and then we have this like weird, incomplete, disjointed streetscape where like a pedestrian often is walking in the middle of roads, and it just doesn't hang together conceptually. So I'm interested in that. And then the north of Fearing idea, I think sounds great. And I like, I like the idea of, I guess, first and foremost, being guided by the master plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that North Pleasant area, like that seems like a great spot to add student density. Okay, that's what I got.
Okay.
Yeah, to Johanna's
Johanna, were you talking about the Mill District, the North Amherst Center?
No, the north end of downtown.
Oh, the north end of downtown. Okay.
Where the art, like around that rotary.
Okay.
And, right now there's just a ton of like surface street parking in what is like prime. Like who wouldn't want to live there? It's amazing, Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, the land use policy map, I can send that around from the master plan. So yeah, what Johanna's saying too, right? So on the corner of so here's the Kendrick Park, but there's Triangle Street, and then even up along this area, there's a few properties owned by the housing authority, but I think the redevelopment potential could be pretty high here, and then even along North Pleasant. So here's beginning, East Pleasant and North Pleasant, and just in this area. The master plan, here's the land use policy.
And Nate, sorry to correct you, but even a little bit farther south, like all the way up to where I would loop in that bank parcel. Yeah.
Yep. So starting here at Triangle Street.
Or starting at Prey Street and going
Prey
north.
Street. Oh, yeah, sorry, Prey Street. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, I was going to give an update later, but, the Dodson and Flinker downtown design standards, they have some draft standards. They're trying to get a working group meeting going in the next 2 weeks, and then it'll become public at some point. They'd like to come to the planning board in October and start shopping around to boards. And so they have some ideas for some of these areas, and then maybe, they don't go as far north or some of these, but we could take what they're doing and say, well, can we apply it elsewhere? I think they have some nice ideas. The land use policy map from the master plan, I'll send that around. Yeah, so, really in 1973, the town had a plan that said identified these village centers, open space around, and then having some density. The zoning kind of responded, but there hasn't been a big zoning change in an effort to say, here's where we like commercial development and retail or active streets, or here's kind of how we want to tier, or have some hierarchy moving outward from the village center. And so the master plan is still in effect. The charter asks that it be updated every 20 years. So around 2030 is when we need a new master plan. So the idea would be probably in a few years, we'd start to work on updating the master plan. I agree. I think I just looked at it for the council. Most of it is still really good. A lot of the things they say are good. I think some of their overall goals need to be reconsidered. So like preserving community character, at some point it's like, well, what does that really mean as a goal? Then the next goal was, have economic vitality and grow and change. And it's like, okay, well, how do you balance those and what do those mean together? But right, if we look at the master plan map, it's like, where do we have infrastructure? Where do we already have development? And there's a few village centers in downtown that really make sense. I think even Pomeroy has some potential, maybe even around Atkins with Hampshire College land. But the South Amherst area, it's very rural. There's not public transportation and infrastructure. The town's been looking at the South Amherst School, and some of the ideas are: do we have a smaller affordable housing development there of maybe 10 or 12 units? We're not going to propose a 5-story building, but right, I think some of those areas we've identified tonight are worth looking at. Lastly, I'll say these purple areas are professional research park or industrial or commercial zones. There's some in North Amherst, and they've been there for a long time and they haven't realized anything yet. And so one of the ideas is, does our professional research park or certain zones, could they be rezoned to also allow for housing? Are they in the right locations? But I wouldn't take away the zone that they're there now and what they allow, but would we add to it, given that in 40 years they haven't been used? Maybe that'll change, maybe not, but I think that's another consideration.
Okay. Angus, and then Jara. Jara's here. I actually noticed that Jara arrived just before 7:30. I'm saying this for the record, so
Oh,
yep,
okay.
Pam can record that.
I'm at 7:34, so I'll change that to 7:30.
Yeah, I thought my clock said 7:28 when I first noticed Jara.
7:28, okay.
Yeah. All right. We want to give you credit for every minute you're here, Jara. Okay, Angus, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just finding this conversation really exciting, and thinking about some of these different options. And I just want to, I think, second what Johanna is saying, that using the master plan to guide this infill work that we're trying to think about doing and developing areas that are already dense. I think there's different ways to think about that. We're exploring this North Amherst overlay, which I think is a great option. And I think one of the things that I'm also hearing is thinking about the BBC and RVC zones, and how to possibly think about increasing density in them and then extending them farther into different, to include different parcels along major frontage roads, is maybe another strategy to think about. That would be maybe a little bit easier, more systemic than doing individual overlays. And we could do a couple of them all at the same time, which would also make it maybe easier for the town council to debate and think about it. Again, without going crazy, but just trying to think about some of these, like along Belchertown Road, along College Street, the portions we've talked about on East Pleasant. All of these, I think, could stand to be, portions of them could stand to be rezoned, and we could think about densifying some of those RVC, BBC zones. Thanks.
All right, Jara.
Hi everyone. I totally agree with Angus. This is a really exciting and interesting conversation, and I apologize for my tardiness. But so I have two questions. As part of the housing production plan, like community engagement process, were there any geographically based exercises? Like, for instance, I've put together events where we have, red dots represent multifamily, blue dots represent single family, green is, preserving open space or something like that, and having people look at an actual map of the town or the county or whatever and using that like density analysis to see where people feel like different housing types might be appropriate. Was there ever, I guess my question is, was there anything like that as a part of the housing production plan process? And if not, like what other geographically specific advice did the production plan give us in terms of where to look for additional opportunities for housing?
Nate?
Yeah, I think there was a community survey. There was a few hundred responses, and there was a few questions that actually asked. I forget now when it was eventually finalized in its form, but it did ask some questions to try to get people to say, where do you want density? And we had maybe a drop-down menu of specific areas, as opposed to just generically, we're trying to, I don't want to say force a response, but actually have people say where they do or don't want it, as opposed to more broadly. I think in one of the forums, they also did do kind of the dots or some stickers. So there is some of that. I'd have to research it a little bit. I know we did. I'm not sure what the responses were. In terms of the sites, part of the housing production plan is identifying areas where where some of the strategies could be implemented. And so in this housing production plan, there was a few sites that the property owners said they'd be willing to put in there and could be open to the possibility of something happening. So, previously in the previous housing production plan, we just took, East Amherst and the Bank of America parking lot off South Prospect, and there's a vacant property down in Pomeroy, and just said, could you develop those using different housing typologies? So each, this is like corridor development. This was kind of cottage style. This was, more dense infill. And this current housing production plan, there's like, I don't know, 3 to 5 sites, and same thing. But the idea was maybe these are actually sites that could then be followed up with and have real development happen, as opposed to being just kind of a more hypothetical. But I think we haven't identified yet kind of that parcel specific approach. From this conversation, I think I have like a dozen areas. Some of it would be if we start honing in on something, then it is probably time to talk to some property owners or neighbors and say, what is the appetite for some of this, and what could happen. I think the idea of like East Amherst, there's a lot of opportunity there, given that the zoning doesn't limit much. I know a few property owners are a little anxious. I mean, they're actually eager. They'd like a zoning change so they could redevelop along, in East Amherst. And so, someone would be, well, what does that mean? And would they be willing to have conversations with staff or board members to try to, further that? So,
Nate, isn't that an area where you said there was a potential historic district being proposed?
yeah, here, this is, generally East Amherst. Here's the Fort River Elementary School. Here's the Common. And so I'll annotate. This is actually the oldest section of town, and there's a local historic district being proposed, and the area for it is really here. And the area I would consider rezoning would be, south of it here. So, there might be a little overlap, but I think there is a different,
Okay.
yeah. So to me, the local historic district didn't come down to College Street. I think there's a different character there in terms of the age of homes and what they look like.
All right. I always forget to move the phone out of this room. All right. Does anybody have any comments at the moment on, I guess having sort of triggered me about the historic districts, we have I guess we have 2 downtown, and I've always felt like those regulatory bodies resist change. And if we were, say, to greatly relax the zoning in one of those, we'd sort of be running counter against how those folks view their purpose, I guess. Bruce, I know you're on the historic Commission, what do you think about historic districts? And if we were to relax zoning in areas that are overlap with historic districts?
I'm on the Historic District Commission. Actually, I'm not. I suddenly discovered the day before yesterday.
Oh, really?
Um,
Oh,
yeah. But I haven't thought about the two together. There hasn't seemed to be much. I don't, Doug, I have to dig into that a little bit. I can simply say straight off that I haven't thought of any conflicts or opportunities that would anything pro or con for that. But you might be able to. No, the Historic District Commission is you know, and it's trying to preserve and and maintain a look and a feel. So it's not really trying to inflate or deflate what's there. It's trying to essentially manage
that's
what's
what I
there.
mean. That's what I mean. You know, if we were to relax zoning, say along both sides of Fearing Street. I mean, I know we just talked about the north side of Fearing Street, which is not
Yeah.
in the historic district. Hypothetically, you know, the south side is in the historic district. So, you know, and if so, I mean, it's just, you know, I think there's generally, I feel like the historic district is trying to freeze what's there. And so that is running counter to redevelopment that would allow greater density or occupancy.
It may be. I, 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 I don't entirely agree. I think that insofar as we are thinking perhaps about the north side of Fearing Street, I think we could structure our much as you were suggesting, and I guess I'm looking at the person I'm talking to, and the screen moves around, and I get discombobulated. But we could structure the overlay, the design guidelines, or more around creating, stimulating, or even disallowing buildings that would be out of scale or inappropriate, which is probably why I think that what we might seek to encourage in the Fearing Street would be quite different from what we are seeking to encourage in North Amherst. So I think, yes, the Historic District Commission's goals and guidelines, we've just actually, we're working on producing a set of guidelines, and that would be helpful for this board to indicate, you know, what the commission values. But I think that would probably be, we would take those guidelines and the experience of the commission to guide the way in which the overlay design restrictions or objectives were framed.
Okay. All right. Well, we've now got a lot of hands, starting with you, Nate, and then 3 more.
Sure. I was gonna say the local historic district, I think there's 180 Fearing. If you look it up, it's on the corner of Sunset and Fearing. It's a multi-unit development. Through the local historic district, some of the units were redesigned and the site plan was changed. You know, to me, that was probably given where the local historic districts are, there hasn't been a lot of projects, say, for bigger development, say bigger in terms of units or size of buildings. So I think that one was a nice process. Some people might say it's anti-development. It doesn't necessarily have to be. I think it's really trying to shape the appearance and the massing. And so, agreed, if we relax, say, the zoning in the Sunset Fearing neighborhood, and we said we allow cottage-style development, and there's some bigger lots there, that would have to go through the local historic district. To me, that would just mean that the style and massing and the location of the structures would have to be compatible with the neighboring properties and buildings. So I don't think it's an impossibility. It might add another layer of review.
Yeah.
The only other one I was thinking is Amherst Media was proposed a new building on the corner of on the Main Street and Gray Street, and that was approved through a lengthy process. But eventually there was a building that I think everyone thought was much improved compared to what was originally proposed. So, I don't think they're incompatible. I think it is. I agree. It's another permit. It's another review. I think, to me, I would then be aware of, if we do change zoning, how do those interact? And so, right, if we're saying, well, now we allow 5-story buildings in some of these areas, and the local historic district would say, well, that's not really compatible, then maybe that approach to density or size doesn't work, right? So I think in the local historic district areas, you still could allow doubling of density, tripling of density, perhaps even, and still get approved through the local historic district. It's the approach that an applicant or developer would use. So, are they going to do?
Well, I mean, wasn't there that, I mean, I don't remember how really nice or the architectural character of that property on Faring Street that was shot down by the historic district and did increase the density on that lot. And I thought, I mean, I didn't follow it closely, but it felt like the primary reason for shooting it down was not about the architectural character. It was about the addition of parking and units that students might live in.
Yeah, so there was a proposal for a property on Fearing. The applicant withdrew. This was, gosh, I guess it was probably a year and a half ago. And there's an existing 3-story building, a 3-unit building. It's 2.5 stories, and they were going to. It's a pretty big lot. They could have added 5 or 6 units or something. The local historic district commission looked at it. I do think that they changed the plans, but the buildings themselves were really big. So at one point they were going to put it in an apartment building, and then they decided they were going to put in 3 duplexes, and each duplex I think was like 40 by 40 and 2.5 stories. And so the buildings themselves were actually pretty massive footprints. And so, to me, it's like if they had done, like an addition to the house, right? They could have done it so maybe it looked like a barn, or maybe it was an addition to the house, and they could have added 3 units that worked, but instead the idea was to have kind of big footprints, big square hip roof buildings that to me architecturally didn't work with the surroundings. So it never actually I don't know if it actually became a full application of the local historic district. I think it was actually just a preview of what they're doing, and then the applicant withdrew, getting a sense that what they were proposing probably wouldn't be approved, but it actually never moved forward as a formal application. I think that could have happened, actually. They just never proposed it.
Okay. Jesse.
Just a quick information question. So is that true about then the ADU by right as well would go to the historic district for review? Just it hadn't come up in any of our conversations, just wondering.
Right, yeah, so yeah, any project in a local historic district, so even the new ADUs that are allowed from the state, they still have to be reviewed by the local historic district commission. So the one at the corner of Lincoln and Fearing, when that came forward, the applicant had done a fair amount of research. The local historic district commission made a few changes that to me improved the building. So a steeper pitched roof, porticos on the entries, and I think some variation in siding material. And so maybe even windows, but so the footprint necessarily didn't change and what the layout of the interior was, but those few changes to me to the exterior were an improvement. So now you have, instead of a kind of an odd low pitched roof, I think it was like an 8 or 10 pitch, and you had some nice entries. And so as opposed to like the pre-cast concrete stairs, you had say some wider entries. And so to me, the applicant seemed pretty willing, and to me those are changes that will make the structure look nicer. So
quick side note, if anybody wants to see what an ADU looks like, drive by that corner, because the foundation's down on the first floor and it looks very big, just for the record.
Okay. Fred.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that the north side of Faring Street, I think, is definitely a legitimate area to look at. It has really been through the ringer for decades now, and that's probably the most constructive thing that's now available for it. So, so I don't know. That's it's too bad, but you can't go backwards. I don't think so.
Okay. Angus.
Yeah, I was just gonna add that, I'm a historian by training, and so I like historic districts in a lot of ways, but I'll just add that, I mean, at least most studies that look at things, different kinds of overlays that we can place for zoning, find that historic designations like this do tend to decrease density and tend to put up roadblocks for developers. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it would happen here, but at least across the country, that tends to be what happens when you create a historical designation like this.
All right. Okay, the time is 8:09. I don't see any hands at the moment. We have no public attendees. We usually take a break around now. Do people feel like it's time to do that, or do they want to plow through and just try to get through everything else if we're done with this? I saw
I would-
several nods when I said, let's take a break. So why don't we take a 5-minute break, come back at 8:15? Johanna, were you going to suggest we keep going?
Well, I was going to ask how long we thought the rest of the content might be projected to take. As if we take a 5-minute break and then we have 5 more minutes of content, that seems silly.
Well, we have the usual sort of the regular items with the old and new business, the form, the applications, which ones are coming, and then we have the committee and liaison reports. And from my perspective, it doesn't have to take long. Nate, what do you think? Is that a substantive?
I was going to preview the zoning priorities list and a few things. It might take, more than 10 minutes.
15,
but
15
yeah,
minutes to get through it?
right.
Then I propose we take a break.
Okay. All right, so come back at 8:15. Thank you. All right, my clock is showing 8:16. I don't know if anybody's hiding behind their cameras that are off. But if you are around, please turn your camera back on. All right, we got everybody back but Johanna. Here she is.
Yes.
Okay, time is 8:18 and we'll go ahead. We had gotten to a point in the conversation about housing where I didn't see any hands from anyone. Nate, did you want to probe any more on that topic tonight, or did you get kind of what you were hoping for?
Yeah, no, I think that was a good start to a conversation, so I don't think we need to belabor it tonight. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay, we'll move on to next topic, which is old business. Anything not reasonably anticipated in advance, Pam or Nate? Nothing.
No.
Okay. How about for new business? Anything?
No.
Nope. Nate? No? Nothing?
No, I was just thinking we have I think what's the next one with the site plan reviews, we have a few upcoming, but
Okay. All right. So for Form A subdivision, A&R subdivision applications, anything? Nothing.
No, not at this point.
Okay. ZBA?
And I'm not aware of anything, Nate, to bring forward. Are you?
I'm not either, actually.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And SPP, SPR, and SUB applications?
Yeah, so 363 Main Street, I think I mentioned this, Bruno's Pizza, they're reducing the size of their restaurant space and putting an extra residential unit. And it's a mixed-use building that at the time was permitted through a special permit with the zoning board. It'll come to the planning board at the next October meeting, October 8th. So it'll be a site plan review and a special permit. And we can have a site visit. There's not really many exterior changes at all, actually. It's really a change in it's amending the previous special permit, and then it's also allowing some conditions in terms of a mixed-use building. So you can see that. We mentioned the new building down in East Amherst that Amir Mikchi had developed behind the Florence Savings Bank. He's currently going through the Conservation Commission, or starting to put a similar building across the street. And so that it hasn't been officially filed with the planning board yet, but that'll be a site plan review application and possibly a special permit application for additional height. And that'll be, if not October 22nd, then probably in early November.
Okay. All right, moving on to committee and liaison reports. Bruce, anything for PVPC?
No, there's an October 9th face-to-face, so maybe one day.
Okay. Jesse, anything on housing and zoning subcommittee?
You've heard a lot of it. I think we started some new conversations about zoning with Angus's leadership on that front. I think, Nate, you were going to talk about this a bit.
Yeah, I'll share my screen. Staff had a few years ago had a zoning priority list. The Community Resources Committee of the Town Council had one. And, we've achieved a fair amount. There's been a few zoning changes. And so we've developed a new list. I think it's something for the board to look at. And if you want to email me before the next meeting, I think the idea would be to identify, zoning strategies that staff could work on, and then that the Housing and Zoning Subcommittee could work on. And then, like we said, maybe it's some that then we could have a joint meeting with the Housing Trust, or we could talk to the CRC or Housing Trust and see if they'd want to pick them up. And so, the zoning can be anything from like technical fixes to, rewriting a whole, the sign bylaw. So I'll share the screen now. I think I have that available. Maybe hold on a sec. And I think and I think it's, sometimes what happens is we develop these lists and then we kind of lose focus. So I'd like to kind of keep this going, right? So for instance, the multi-use apartment overlay that was developed in 2013, it never went anywhere.
So
And then
Nate,
the planning department,
we're not seeing your screen yet.
yeah, I'm just
Okay,
mentioning, so
just wanted to,
yeah. So for instance, like the multi-unit apartment overlay in 2013, it didn't make it to a zoning amendment. It seemed it was like too fraught. It was town-wide, but no one then said, well, what if we just look at one section? But instead we just moved on, or the department at the time and zoning committee just moved on to a whole nother, zoning idea. And maybe that one should have been, thought about a little bit more at the time. And so I'd like to have a nice list, keep it going, and, refer back to it every now and then. So, the current list is, there's a dozen or so things, identify areas for new development. We've kind of talked about that. Looking at the BL area around downtown in anticipation of the design review standards being complete. The sign bylaw. So right now we have a section of our bylaw that, deals with signs, and that is really out of date and needs to be updated. South Hadley is just doing that right now. So there is a local community. A lot of these are kind of housing related. So allowing multiple principal dwellings on a property, I think that's a really important one. Cottage style development. One right here, limited site plan review or administrative approval for protected uses. And, in the last 2 years, a lot of the planning board hearings have been for what are considered protected uses by Mass General Law. So, a group home down in South Amherst, the conversion of the motel in East Amherst to residential use, the Dickinson Museum Carriage House. And other communities approach that with limited site plan review or administrative approval. And if it's maybe a big enough project, it gets full site plan review. But I think that there's probably, we could maybe look at what conditions we impose on some of these projects and come up with a way to categorize them and maybe limit what gets to a full site plan review, right? It gives the planning board more time to do other things and helps the applicant. 40Y overlay, that's a starter home overlay, a senior housing, fix the definition of owner occupied. And then, there was a kind of a question asked at the Housing and Zoning Subcommittee, how much, in a site plan review hearing, sometimes we can spend, the planning board and staff, we can all spend a lot of time talking about certain things that are, say, details, and is there ways to build in some more pre-requirements for a site plan review application, so that, if utilities need to be screened and an applicant comes in and just, they're not screening the utilities, can we say that's an incomplete application and get to a point where we have certain standardized conditions we kind of do now, but make those part of an application process. So what the board is discussing isn't, it can be other parts of the project. Change the PRP zoning. I mentioned that as part of our discussion. Modify mixed-use building standards and outline village centers or even in downtown. So we have a 30% in the overlay. We had a depth, to 24 feet, 75 along 75% of the facade length. So it was a different definition or standard for the non-residential piece. Maybe that needs to be explored. And then in the zoning bylaw, we used to refer to the permit granting board, the zoning board, the planning board, and the permit granting authority. And then a few years ago, we tried to standardize that and say the permit granting authority. And there's a definition, but we never actually went back and changed it within the zoning bylaw. So, again, I think in Article 7, for instance, about parking and landscape standards, I think most of the references to permit board should just be permit granting authority. The difference being that in the permit granting authority, it names the building commissioner or staff if the application or change could be administratively approved. And we can discuss it more, but it's, to me that says that if someone's coming in, they're having a minor change to a site plan, say it's to some parking issues. If we say the permit granting authority related to parking, the building commissioner could look at it and say, oh, you just want to move your islands around a little bit. That's fine. The way it's worded now, that kind of change would actually come back to the planning board as a full site plan review application because there's no way to handle that kind of change administratively. So there could be others. Some of these are really big, like cottage style development could be, something the planning board directs the housing and zoning subcommittee to really look into, or maybe that's something that we want the housing trust to do, but that could be, looking at case studies, looking at different, actually zoning bylaws and proposing what works in town, where, what zoning districts. The sign bylaw could be really technical, but something that the building commissioner, inspectors, and staff use a lot. So, this isn't prioritized, it's enumerated, but it's not prioritized. So, this has been shared out. If you have other ideas, we can add them to the list and then talk about it and then, subsequent meetings.
All right. So you're inviting us to add to this list.
Yep, or add comments or, yep.
Okay. Johanna.
If it truly is what you're describing, Nate, I would just move that we do point 14 right now so that we can cut unnecessary, silly red tape.
All right. Bruce.
I just wanted to ask a question about the open space and community development bylaw. I have a special interest in that, of course, because it kind of grew out of the co-housing initiatives in town. Is that being used, Nate? Is there any reason to, after 15, 20, 25, 20 years, 25 years, to modify it, tweak it, refine it in any way to make it more useful? Because it was intended to be a kind of a middle ground between special permits and so forth, and then the or subdivisionals, and all the way the PUD, plan the PUD or PURD required an approval by town meeting, which was basically made it an unworkable arrangement. So the OSCD was put in to basically allow PUD type development on a smaller scale. I thought it was a rather significant improvement or addition, because it was a whole new development mechanism or approach, and I'd like to know how it's going, and is it being used enough, or are there any obvious rough edges that would make it more useful?
Yeah, So, in our bylaw, in the zoning bylaw, there's a few different development methods, right? There's, like a traditional subdivision, cluster, this open space conservation development, planned urban residential development. I just put this as 15. And so to me, like cottage style development would be perhaps another development method. I think, Bruce, to your point, I think it's something to look at. Sometimes they have some of these development methods haven't been used very much. It could be complicated. It could be that they, if they need a special permit for whatever reason, they haven't been used a lot. And so, Doug, going back to what you're saying about allowing smaller lots or trying to encourage certain kind of style development in terms of housing type, we could tweak or have a new, development method, right, that applies in certain zoning districts that gets to some of what you were saying. And so I think it's worth looking at those development methods. So some of them haven't been used really at all, right? I mean, for years. And so, for instance, will a cluster subdivision, there's been a few, but, could we modify it to do something else? Or could we even make, in a cluster, could we actually allow even smaller lots to get to what, what we're saying in terms of density or different kinds of housing? So, the open space conservation development, I'm trying to think.
Community development.
Yeah, they haven't, community development, it's been used. I don't know, Vista Terrace down in South Amherst by Atkins may have been that, but it may have just been a traditional cluster. And so the last one that may have been used was, it's been a number of years. There's the one off State Street, and then there's another one. So not a lot.
Yeah, I know it's got a 150-foot setback, I think, from farmland, which that seems to me to be a bit of a stretch. I mean, an unnecessarily conservative setback.
Yeah, I think that's something to examine.
I don't know whether that's made any difference to anybody. It would to us. I mean, we had considered at one point changing our 5 commingled lots, each of which is developed with a separate special permit. So we have a co-housing community, but its land use permitting basis is 5 separate special permits. I mean, it's a crazy mess, and it made Bob Mitchell in 1990s more or less weep into his hands as I was explaining it to him. And so this was supposed to make that kind of nonsense go away. So when it came out, I thought, well, maybe we'll just see if we can convert ourselves to an OSCD, and we ran right up against the 150-foot setback from the farmland that you couldn't do it. So it basically eliminated any possibility that we could be use this development method.
Yeah, so the development method can be applied in different zoning districts, and you can have different standards. And so, yeah, I think we can add to the list for instance, the community homes that's under construction at the corner of Montague Road and Pulpit Hill could almost have been one of these development methods, but it was just too complicated to draw all these individual lot lines and with the utilities and parking, and so they needed a little bit more flexibility. So he said, let's make it a comprehensive permit. But if some of these development methods were a little bit more flexible, we could have those kinds of developments elsewhere in town without having to go through, some really complicated permitting. And so I think it's worth looking at, is it, like a few standards or requirements within the development method that, if modified, would allow, clustering of homes without a traditional subdivision, elder places. And that's, if we want to encourage that, then, we can look at, right, those kinds of changes.
Okay, that's enough.
All right. Nate, I'm not seeing any other hands right now. But oh, there's Angus. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just gonna ask, or maybe make a suggestion, which is kind of about the maybe next steps. And I'm wondering if this is something, it feels like the next steps are, we need to kind of prioritize which things the planning board would be interested in kind of pushing forward ourselves, which things we'd like the staff to focus on. And so I guess I'm wondering, does it make sense for us in this meeting to talk through what our to kind of rank some of these? Or does it make sense for the Housing and Zoning Subcommittee in our next meeting to spend some time trying to think and rank and then bring it back to the planning board for kind of everyone's input? What are we thinking in terms of like the next steps for the process?
Nate, do you have any initial reaction to that?
I think we could wait to hear back from other board members. And then at the, Housing and Zoning Subcommittee, we could then talk about it and bring it back to the board. So, my thought would be at, the next 1 or 2 planning board meetings, this would be its own agenda topic, and we could, put some time into it. And then, work at that level. I think the Housing and Zoning Subcommittee could also discuss it at the next meeting too, add to it, maybe come up with a, kind of a rough prioritization.
All right. I saw another hand and then it went away. Okay. Bruce is waving me off. All right. All right, then we'll move on, I guess. We were up, that was the Housing and Subcommittee conversation. Angus, have you entered into CPAC world yet? No.
I don't think I've been voted on yet.
Okay, are we waiting, Nate, for the town manager to appoint him or something?
Oh, maybe. Yeah, I'll make a note of that. I think they were waiting to have another representative from another committee, and then I think the idea was to try to bring the CPA committee appointments at one meeting. At this point, I think I'm not
They
sure.
already voted on one person at the last meeting, or like 2 meetings ago.
Right.
But it wasn't me.
All right, yeah, I'll look into that. I thought, yeah, I know I communicated it with the town manager's office that you were the planning board representative, so.
It took Rob a long time, sorry, Paul, a long time to get me onto the planning commission. So lighting a fire under him is probably a good idea.
And Nate, would it be okay for Angus to attend their meetings in the interim?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, or you can watch the videos. I will say proposals are due September 30th, and then the committee really starts their work.
Oh, so he
in-
hasn't missed much yet.
Yeah, in mid October. So
Okay. All right. And then we haven't, Nate, did you talk to Karen at all about the DRB, and is she going to report, or should we take this off the agenda until next June?
no, I haven't talked to her. I was going to wait to hear back from the town manager's office, but I think I could just ask staff, and then I can come back to the board with a report.
Okay. Okay. I don't really have any report of chair. I was going to mention, I think Nate may have mentioned, in October our schedule is not the usual 1st and 3rd, because the 1st of October is Yom Kippur, so we're not meeting on the 1st. We meet on the 8th, and then what is it, the 22nd, I guess. So just to let you all know that. Bruce.
On the meeting of the 8th, I'll probably ask what we'll maybe agenda a brief moment about the planning board picnic, or whatever we want to call it, at my place, which is on the following weekend. So who brings what, and I want to manage expectations, generally downward, but we'll see. So
well, we should know the weather by then too.
Yes, yes. So remind me to do that. Thank you.
Okay. All right, that's all I had. Nate and Pam, any report from staff?
I was going to say that there's the Amherst Block Party tomorrow evening. It's happening downtown. The downtown design standards, as I mentioned, hopefully there'll be a presentation to the board in October to look at draft standards. There's the East Amherst Local Historic District. The commission just voted this week to approve the study report, preliminary study report. It'll be sent to Massachusetts Historical Commission. And then within that, so there's 90 days to provide comment. During that comment period, the planning board also needs to hold a public meeting. I think it's just a public meeting to review the report. So in October or early November, the planning board will need to review the preliminary study report for East Amherst. I'm not sure if it's it is the board is named in the process. I think it was just an idea to provide comments and ideas and suggestions for the study committee. I think that's it.
All right. Anyone have anything else? Time is 8:41. All right, we will see you October 8th.
Hey.
Enjoy the rest of the month and see you later. Good night.
Night.
Everyone.
Not everyone, thanks.
Stop recording.
Good night, Pam.
Recording stopped.
Okay. Good night, Mr. Marshall. We'll talk to you soon.
All right, bye.
Bye.